So I'd like to welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for this presentation on transhumanism, humanity's make or break century, brought to you by Centre for Inquiry Canada. I'm Shauna Watson. I'm Vice President of CFIC. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. First, while we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we call home. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. We would also acknowledge that not all people came here as migrants or settlers, recognizing those who were brought involuntarily as enslaved people or by means of human trafficking, and we pay tribute to those ancestors and to their descendants. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve relationships between nations, peoples, and cultures, to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and to consider how we can each try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. In the interest of widely disseminating this information, such as the topic of today's talk, we're not requiring payment or membership for people to attend. We think this sort of information is important for everyone. CFIC is an educational charity promoting human rights, science, and critical thinking. In order to support this work, our operation relies on funds from memberships and donations. If you can help even a little, please visit our website at the URL posted on the chat window. All donations are tax deductible. This talk is being recorded for publication on CFIC's YouTube channel. If this is a concern for you, please turn off your video. You are also welcome to replace your name with a pseudonym. Following the talk, we'll be accepting written questions using the Zoom chat feature, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please keep your questions short and to the point. We've enabled access for everyone to the Zoom chat to collect questions and also for people to post if they're having technical issues. In all cases, we expect participants to be respectful of the speakers and also of other audience members. Now, I will introduce you to our speaker. Elise Bohan is a senior research scholar at the University of Oxford's Future Superhuman Institute. She holds a PhD in evolutionary macrohistory, wrote the world's first book-length history of transhumanism as a doctoral student, and recently launched her debut book, Future Superhuman, Our Transhuman Lives in a Make or Break Century. I believe the link for that has been posted in the chat as well. Her present interests include existential risk and how to maximize positive outcomes in a rapidly changing world. Welcome, Elise.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really great to be here to speak to you all today. So I'm going to jump straight in with a story drawn from probability theory that I think can help us make sense of what's at stake for humanity in the 21st century. Some of you might know this one. It's about the urn that's filled with lots and lots of colored balls. And as we pluck the balls from the urn, we mostly pick out white ones, which represent things that are beneficial for humanity. Things like, say, vaccines for polio, modern sanitation, and anesthetics. Of course, sometimes we pick out a gray ball, which means something that's more of a mixed blessing. You could say that things like that might encompass the harnessing of fossil fuels or perhaps the advent of factory farming. So on and on we go throughout history, pulling white and grey balls out of the urn. Some of these are very good, some of them are both good and bad. But what if somewhere in the vast repository of the urn lies a black ball? A technology or a chain of events so powerful that it's guaranteed to destroy us if we pull it out of the urn. Now, sure, we make progress when we pull more white balls from the urn, and we know from history that there are lots and lots of them. Perhaps we'll pull out a cure for cancer soon, or reliable malaria prophylaxis, or even a universal flu vaccine. But every time we put our hand back in the urn, we risk pulling out that black ball. So the key idea is that as we chase progress and as our technologies advance, their destructive potential increases. And the probability of really bad things happening increases with time when you're already sitting on very destructive things like nuclear weapons. Thankfully, we've kept nukes mostly out of play for the last 70 years. But can we keep them out of play for hundreds or thousands of years into the future? I know the urn is an imperfect metaphor, but it sets the stage for us to think about how risk compounds over time. Sit on advanced technologies with major destructive potential for long enough, and sooner or later, your number will come up. So at this point, maybe some of you are thinking, uh-oh, have I signed myself up for an ultra depressing doomsday talk? Is this going to be one of those, hey, everything's going to hell in a handcart speeches? Hopefully you can exhale a little bit, because I promise it's a more interesting story than that. We will talk very seriously about some big risks and also some confronting choices. But what I hope this talk represents is everything that the Centre for Inquiry stands for. It's vital that we are able to use critical thinking, science, and reason to address complex and confronting ideas. And that's really what I want to engage with all of you in today. So in that spirit, we're going to talk about some of the big ideas in my book, Future Superhuman, which has the subtitle, Our Transhuman Lives in a Make or Break Century. It's a small book in terms of physical size, but it's packed with big ideas, some of them exciting and many of them confronting. I wrote it because I believe that these are ideas that matter. They're ideas about our species' vast long-term potential, the many short-term stumbling blocks that we face, and how hard it can feel to be a human living through times of rapid upheaval and change. I really think we need better stories about what it means to be a person living through what looks poised to become one of the most disruptive periods in human history. The long arc of human history often reduces individuals to statistics. And those statistics tell very important stories, as anyone who spent any time on the website Our World in Data will know. But I thought it was really important to dedicate the second half of my book, after all the big picture setup, to telling what I call the human story of how we might experience and struggle to process and adapt to some of the changes that are presently unfolding. Very briefly, the big picture story says that either we use technology to upgrade and become smarter and less tribal and less myopic, or we face an uncomfortably high chance of unraveling human progress and destroying the future potential of Earth-originating intelligent life this century. But the human story says, okay, so maybe there's a need for some more technology, but we're living in this awkward transition phase and we're not yet superhuman. Yet we've got this increasingly godlike technology to contend with, and it's barreling into our lives, disrupting things at an astonishing pace. How do we process and prepare for this? How do we find ways to make sense of the state of the world today and our place in it? One of the big impediments to building reliable maps and forging useful stories about the modern world is the fact that we humans like to talk about lots of topical disruptions as if they're happening in isolation. We can think of things like climate change, automation and the reshuffling of the labor force, rising involuntary celibacy, new waves of feminism and men's rights activism, declining global fertility rates, housing crises, kids living with their parents into their 30s, the epidemic of mental health issues, and the hijacking of our brains by social media. These are not isolated phenomena. I maintain that they're part of a larger story about a species in transition. And I'm very happy to talk about any and all of those points in question time. I promise I'm going to leave lots of time left over to have a proper conversation with as many of you as possible. But I'm going to stick with the broader summary arc for now, just so you guys can get a sense of what the thrust of the arguments is. Basically, I argue that these are all symptoms of life in a transhuman era, a time when technology stands to change everything about humanity as we know it, from our minds and bodies to our values and ways of life. A transhuman era describes a big evolutionary transition. The best case scenario is that we transition to something we might call superhuman. That means we upgrade our intelligence so that we're smart enough to neutralize the threat of that black ball in the urn. And if we are that smart, or give rise to machines that are smarter than anyone alive today, the possibilities could be wondrous. Unraveling the mysteries of cognition and consciousness, curing diseases, and discovering ever more about how the universe works. It would be the ultimate hubris to consider humanity the finished, perfect end goal of evolution. We are a species, after all, that to this day routinely enslaves each other by the millions. That is, as we speak, waging pointless, destructive wars. That mutilates the genitals of young girls by the hundreds of millions to prevent them having or enjoying sex. And that keeps billions of its fellow creatures enslaved in factory farms, living lives of omnipresent torture. The idea that this is the optimum of existence, or that we represent a paragon of excellence, I think is absurd. There could be so much more to life, to experience, and to existence than we know. In the same way that we consider human lives richer, deeper, and more meaningful than those of a cat, a cockroach, or a bacterium. But I know that this is the point in the story where I risk losing you. Am I saying that it's all hopeless? That humanity is rubbish? That I have no affinity or allegiance to my own species? Or that I want to toss it in the rubbish bin of history in pursuit of some perfectionist utopian fantasy? No. What I am really saying is that I love humanity so much that I want it to be the best version of itself that it can be. I want us to look our blind spots and shortcomings in the eye, and then do what humanity does best. Use science, reason, and innovation to try and make things better. The idea that we're living in a make or break century is up there with global poverty, dysentery, and slavery, by which I mean it's confronting, it's overwhelming, and we'd kind of rather not think about it. But this need not be a pessimistic way to think. Remember, it's not just break, it's a make or break century. And the best way of ensuring that the future is bright is by looking the things that could derail it in the eye and banding together to understand those risks and solve for them. Yet that task will forever remain beyond us if we cannot even bear to endure a conversation about the things that scare us most. So in the spirit of forging ahead with hard conversations, why do I think we're living in a make or break century? The argument's pretty simple. We've reached a novel state of technological complexity that's unlike any previous moment in human history. We've pulled so many white and grey balls out of that urn and have capitalized on our new innovations to globalize, get richer, expand the world's population, and even connect 5 billion minds and counting through the global digital brain of the World Wide Web. But the more time that passes and the emptier that urn gets, the odds of us pulling out that black ball increase. And in our lifetimes, the odds of pulling it out are high. Some of the reasons include the fact that we've already invented nuclear weapons, and they are wielded by 9 nation states and counting. The one good thing about nukes is that they're very expensive and hard to make. You can't just assemble one in your garage, which is why they've only ever been produced by state actors. But we're barreling towards a future where people with basic lab equipment and PhD level training can bioengineer deadly pathogens. The kind that could kill hundreds of millions of people and make COVID-19 look like a non-event. And I don't mean in 100 years' time. I mean plausibly this decade. As the AI scientist Ben Goertzel put it, it seems a clear trend that as technology advances, it is possible for people to create more and more destruction using less and less money, education, and intelligence. Speaking of AI, that's the next curveball to fly out of Pandora's box. This century is totally novel in human history because, for the first time ever, we have the technology to invent thinking machines. And we're already embedding them everywhere. In our search engines, in our cars, in the global economic system, and in supply chains. Like electricity, AI is becoming an omnipresent but invisible fact of life. Something so embedded in our map of reality that we hardly notice it. But unlike electricity, AI is learning to reason, make decisions, and act autonomously in the world. That makes it a game changer like no other. It could decide when to carry out an assassination via drone strike, choose to hit the brakes or not when a pedestrian walks in front of your car, crash the stock market, and become such a staple of medical diagnostics that our doctors who are supposed to humanize the tech and work alongside it may default to its wisdom and switch off their own critical faculties, as many of us already do when we blindly follow our GPS, and unfortunately, not always with optimal results. Of course, that's not to say that AI won't unlock an embarrassment of riches for humanity. It's already forecast to add at least $15 trillion to the size of the global economy by the end of this decade. What AI could help humanity achieve is truly wondrous. An end to global poverty, improved farming and manufacturing, safer and greener transport, solutions to climate change, accelerated drug discovery, extended life and health spans, and even deeper forms of companionship as AI learns to hold seamless conversations, which will be especially useful for aged care in a world that's graying fast. But this is the crux of the conundrum. We have big global challenges to address. We have more human-created risks than any of our ancestors have ever had to juggle. Climate change is an obvious case, where we've been tarrying for decades and failing to coordinate proactively as a global civilization. The COVID pandemic is also another great example of how abysmal global collective action is under pressure. The main reason that turned out sort of all right was because the pathogen wasn't as bad as it could have been. Can you imagine humanity getting its act together if a pathogen emerged that transmitted as effectively as measles, where every one person with the disease infects roughly 16 or so others? A pathogen that was airborne and one that was as deadly as untreated Ebola, the bubonic plague, or HIV. In the months that it would take us to decide whether or not to officially declare a pandemic or debate whether we should mask up or social distance, we'd see the streets lined with bodies. Humans aren't built for a world this complex, where the tribe extends to the scale of 8 billion people and counting. We aren't built to think carefully about problems spanning decades, centuries, and millennia. We're short-termists by nature. We're born to gorge on the fruits and berries that we find today, for there may be none tomorrow. Born with the hard wiring that renders us passive addicts to the brain-hacking technologies of the 21st century. They can sway elections, deep fake history, and make us believe that tripling down on ancient cues of fertility and fitness, taking to ever greater extremes in the form of fake breasts, butts, and lips, is a good use of our time, or a meaningful avenue through which to derive self-worth. This tells us much of what we need to know about humanity and our ability to safely steer our way through a century of escalating promise and peril. In the world of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, tomorrow was a long time. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow is an eternity. I know many philosophers and evolutionists have argued that things are going pretty great because overall humanity has expanded its circles of empathy. From small kin-ordered tribes to towns, cities, nations, and the global collective. And even in some cases, non-human life forms. I mean, look at us caring about animal welfare and poverty in other nations. And I do think that our ability to care on a larger scale is remarkable and truly worth celebrating. But the mistake is to imagine that we have a boundless capacity for this, or that we can hold ourselves in this big picture mindset in perpetuity. In reality, we're straining unsustainably as it is to care about things outside of our family, our mortgage, our job, and our small circle of friends and loved ones. When push comes to shove, humans choose self-interest in the form of profits, promotions, nepotism, and cronyism above the welfare of others and the greater good most of the time. This is one of the major reasons why we've been anything but proactive in dealing with climate change. Why worry about big, scary stuff tomorrow when I can make money and have fun today? We choose short-term self-interest over long-term sustainability over and over again, even when we carry placards on the weekend or write op-eds affirming how much we care. How we really choose to live is still focused mostly on ourselves and mostly on the short-term timescale. The only way to really keep our concern for others, including future generations, front of mind is to feel like our own needs are very secure, which leads us to a counterintuitive idea that's really uncomfortable. We're at a precipice in history, a tipping point. Technology isn't going anywhere. If any of the things we revere and value about being human are to survive, things like intelligence, exploration, rationality, connection, love, or the pleasure of finding things out, we're the ones who need to change. Adaptability is about mastering the skills and attributes that allow you to survive and thrive in a given niche. And the human niche is now a technologically infused, extremely complex global system. Yet we're still wired for life on the African savanna. This mismatch cannot persist in perpetuity. If we're going to adapt, we're going to need a little help from our AI friends. The science fiction luminary Arthur C. Clarke put it beautifully when he wrote many decades ago, the dinosaurs disappeared because they could not adapt to their changing environment. We shall disappear if we cannot adapt to an environment that now contains spaceships, computers, and thermonuclear weapons. So, on the note of a species that needs to adapt to a technologically saturated world, enter transhumanism. I was chatting with Shona the other day, and she was telling me about her engineering background and how she's worked with computers since the 70s. She said she was keen to hear more about transhumanism because it's not something that's often talked about. But she must have a sense of it because she also said it's a polarizing topic. And that it most certainly is. The futurist David Wood opened his recent book, Vital Foresight, with a reflection on this point. He wrote, transhumanism, don't put that word on the cover of your book. That's the advice I received from a number of friends when they heard what I was writing about. They urged me to avoid the T word, transhumanism. That word has bad vibes, they said. It's toxic. T for toxic. David acknowledged that he understands why it's an idea that makes many of us feel uncomfortable. But he argued that it's such an important concept, and we shouldn't expunge the word from our vocabulary, even if we find it scary. In his words, it's an apt term for the set of transformational ideas that will be key to our collective well-being in the 2020s and beyond. T for transformational, and yes, T for timely. So what is transhumanism? Basically, it's a philosophy and a social movement that is all about using science and technology to tackle big sustainability risks and to enhance humanity beyond its present capabilities, making us smarter, healthier, wiser, and wealthier. It kicked off as a formally outlined philosophy and organized movement in 1990. But precursor ideas date back as far as the scientific revolution, with Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and others. Essentially, transhumanism is an outgrowth of Enlightenment humanism, but it extends humanism beyond an anthropocentric philosophy. So where humanists see humanity as perfectible through science, reason, education, and cultural improvement, things that can draw out the better angels of our nature, transhumanists are interested in the what next. What happens when we butt up against the limits of human nature itself? What's the next step for survival, self-improvement, and sustainability, which extends our reach beyond the limits of the human condition? It's important to ask this question because no species survives in perpetuity. When humans talk about sustainability, we often talk about our children and our children's children, and then the vision sort of peters out. We also tend to anchor these visions to contemporary versions of what we think a good life looks like, which is usually a slightly romanticized version of the world from our childhood, only usually with less poverty, more trees, and somehow climate change miraculously getting solved. We like to think that our familiar world is the best of all possible worlds. But of course, our ancestors hundreds or thousands of years ago would have thought the same about their world. So what are the odds that we're the first group of humans to be right? Transhumanists tend to be less wedded to the familiar. They want lives to be good for as many conscious beings as possible, but they're less concerned about whether those lifeways are familiar or not. They think that life, intelligence, consciousness, exploration, and communion are wonderful. So much so that they consider it a key moral priority to give intelligent life the best chance of surviving for millions of years into the future. Transhumanists are committed to something you might call dynamic sustainability. That means surviving and thriving through upgrading and change. So why do people hate this idea so much? It surely can't be the surviving and thriving part. So it must be the change. There is no way to spin a story about a rupture in human affairs, even a best case scenario of that, where we see things like the end of global poverty, radical abundance for all sentient beings, more intelligence, longer lives, and less disease. We can't spin any version of that story without making the humans of today feel vulnerable. We like all of these things in increments. Better health? Yes, please. Declining global poverty? Sounds super. And gee, it might be nice if I could be a little better at math or teach myself how to do something clever like learn Mandarin or compose a beautiful violin sonata. Humans like more of all of these things, but too much, too soon, and we can't assimilate it into our maps of reality or our life plans or our sense of self. This often leaves us feeling raised, displaced, adrift, and frightened. So when we hear about any prospect that involves radical, life-exploding change, many people understandably shut down. And they tell themselves, well, that's not for me. I just won't buy in. Okay, so then how many feet away from you is your smartphone right now? We have already bought in by the billions. Humans don't hold referendums on species-changing paradigm shifts. These happen through smaller choices, lots and lots of incremental choices that we fail to associate with their larger world-disrupting ramifications. So what's a human to do when they feel overwhelmed by an idea that threatens their identity, life plans, and short-term interests? Well, one thing you can do is slap a pejorative label on it like toxic. Try and render it unmentionable so that clever, scientifically minded, reasonable people suddenly feel afraid to use the word. It's a brilliant Orwellian tactic. But the incredible irony is that if transhumanism really is one of the most dangerous ideas and movements in the world, and I don't for a second discount that it could be dangerous, we will have a harder time identifying it, critiquing it, engaging with its more troubling aspects, or fighting it if that ultimately proves to be warranted. You can't fight what you cannot see. We are not really addressing any of the dangers by refusing to speak their name. We are just pulling the wool over our eyes in order to feel more comfortable. This is no way to think, and it's no way to live. Again, it's classic human short-termism, prioritizing immediate comfort and emotional reassurance over robust long-term planning and analysis. Transhumanist movements and transhumanist projects will not and have not disbanded. People have gone wobbly on the label, sure, but not on the mission. They just use other labels like artificial intelligence research, techno-progressivism, Web 3.0 and the metaverse, longevity tech, space exploration, personalized medicine, Industry 4.0, and the list goes on. This is what has happened over the past 10 or 15 years. And I'm speaking here as a historian of transhumanism who's written a book-length dissertation on the subject. Transhumanism is a more influential force in our world than ever. Projects that focus on using science and technology to dramatically improve human capabilities, from mapping human cognition to unraveling the mysteries of the human genome, extending human lifespans, and integrating our minds with intelligent AI systems, are being directly pursued by some of the richest and most influential people, corporations, and research institutes in the world. And they're being indirectly pursued by many governments as they funnel ever more money into tech R&D. But the reason this is happening now is not because a group of geeks or nefarious villains got together and decided it would be fun to turn the next chapter of human history into a Star Trek episode. It happened because there is an autocatalytic quality to technological evolution. Once you industrialize and build cheap, powerful machines powered by fossil fuels, you can innovate faster and faster. You use your advanced technologies to build even more advanced technologies, and they unlock more wealth, larger populations, more brain power, and more prosperity, which renders it inevitable that we'll keep chasing new innovations that are more powerful than the last. Nobody planned or decided on this reality. Nevertheless, we find ourselves living in a very technologically advanced civilization, a world where each white ball that we pull out of the urn could unlock an embarrassment of riches and wonders. It is truly a time of great promise, but it's also a world where we need more collective intelligence and better long-range planning abilities to ensure that no black ball emerges from that urn. Sticking our hands in blindly and hoping for the best isn't going to cut it for very long. As I see it, the ism of transhumanism as an organized movement and ideology is actually a lot less important than the key idea that we're living in a transhuman era. We're a species in transition, facing an evolutionary imperative to adapt to the tech-saturated world that we've seeded. The alternative is that we fade away as a historical anachronism, taking the vast potential of Earth-originating intelligent life with us. It doesn't matter whether we like this state of affairs or not. It only matters whether it's likely to be true. Now, could the embrace of AI as a way out of our sustainability challenges go badly? Yes, very. I'm not championing it as some kind of misanthrope who would love to see the end of the human era. I'm talking through what I see as a very hard choice. There are always downsides to introducing more technology into the world. We are facing a very complex juggling act in the 21st century, and the stakes are uncomfortably high. There are so many subsets of these ideas that I'd love to take questions on, so I'll hand it back in a moment. But I'd like to leave you with these parting words from the great humanist thinker, Bertrand Russell. Men fear thought as they fear nothing else on earth, more than ruin, more even than death. Thought is subversive and revolutionary, destructive and terrible. Thought is merciless to privilege, established institutions, and comfortable habits. Thought is anarchic and lawless, indifferent to authority, careless of the well-tried wisdom of the ages. Thought looks into the pit of hell and is not afraid. It sees man, a feeble speck, surrounded by unfathomable depths of silence. Yet it bears itself proudly, as unmoved as if it were the lord of the universe. Thought is great and swift and free, the light of the world and the chief glory of man. If nothing else, I hope this has been a talk that inspires thought. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Elise, for an interesting and thought-provoking talk. Now we will turn it over for questions from the audience. And again, I ask you to please post your questions in the chat window. I'll start with a question. Does Elise Bohan support transhumanistic values?
Great one to kick off. Yeah, loosely speaking, I would say that I find a transhumanist worldview compelling. And yeah, I essentially do support the values of trying to maximize the potential of the human species using science and technology to help us become more than what we are. I'm definitely on board with that. But I should say that I'm not a card-carrying transhumanist in the sense that I'm not really affiliated with the organizations. I'm not really enmeshed in the world where you kind of meet up and all sort of subscribe to the same community. I've met lots of transhumanists. They're interesting people. But in terms of a movement, I wouldn't say that that's where my values or allegiance lies so much as the core ideas of, extending the humanist project, using science and technology to solve the big challenges of the day. That's definitely what I'm on board with.
Thank you. Okay, question. It's clear that past prognostications for the future of humanity have vastly overestimated advances in transportation and vastly underestimated advances in information processing and communication. So I'm wondering, do you have any second thoughts about what we might have got wrong about predictions regarding transhumanism?
Oh, I would love if whoever asked that question, I would love it if you could jump on the call and just flesh out the question a little bit more for me, because I great risk that I'll sort of ramble on a tangent that's not really what you're after. So if you're there, I'll
confess it's my question.
Okay, well then, brilliant. Please do expand.
So I mean, when you look at the predictions from say the middle part of the last century about how we'd all have flying cars and be living on the moon, and we're nowhere near any of that. However, the idea that we can now have computers in our pockets and be able to talk to people halfway across the world as if they're in the same room didn't even occur to most people. There, some science fiction writers touched on it, but they were nowhere near where we are today.
Yeah, okay. I definitely get where you're going with this. And excellent question. Yeah, I think that this is a great historical example that should give us pause for a lot of our prognostications. I think the one thing that you can tend to do is fairly reasonable generalist predictions. The idea that, we're going to have accelerated economic growth, like a continuation of more and more information technology getting smarter and more powerful at a faster rate. There's no guarantee that or any trend continues in perpetuity, but we can certainly imagine it continuing for many decades. But once you get into the specifics, and I found this writing a book, it was really interesting. The almost the imperative to give people a sense of the squishy, sensory taste and smells of a future world. Journalists in particular really want you to make it vivid for us. What's it going to be like in the middle of the century? What would it be like if there was a singularity? And the answer is almost certainly whatever we try and characterize will be hopelessly wrong. Because when you're talking about these feedback loops of technological progress, you get these incremental innovations in those feedback loops that are different to what we would have imagined. And that seeds the next generation and the next generation and kind of splinters things off in really unexpected ways. And the reality for fictionalizing this stuff as well is that stuff like electricity or AI is really boring to write about because, like I said, it's like omnipresent but invisible. We want stories that are anthropomorphized, which is why we tell these stories of flying cars and living on the moon and, you know, space food and spacesuits and stuff that kind of has that razzle dazzle quality to it. I would expect that some of the most disruptive things that will happen in our lifetimes is stuff that to a storyteller's eye might seem very, very banal, but nevertheless, as with information technology, will change the game entirely.
Thank you. Okay, what makes you believe that transhumanism is not just continuing like any other capitalist or consumerist project, like all the other technological developments we're seeing?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Again, if the questioner wants to jump in, I would love to hear from them.
Okay, would the questioner like to clarify this?
Yeah. So basically, what we have, so basically, what you say is that transhumanism is some, as far as I understand it, some fundamental change, in technology or how people live and develop. Like you mentioned, for example, developing super intelligence and stuff like this. But I mean, I right now have the feeling that all of these new tech developments are just like basically supporting the consumerist behavior of people. So they just buy stuff and keep consuming and keep destroying the planet with all their pollution and CO2 production and all that stuff. So, I mean, are you really optimistic in terms of like that these new developments will really make the world a better place or even save humanity and biodiversity and that kind of stuff? Because I mean, I think the problem is that we have to save the world within the next 50 years. Otherwise, it's too late, And if we don't manage to get the curve within these 50 years, it's probably too late for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of species.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. That's really, really helpful. Yeah, I think so. Basically, it's a version of the greatest minds of my generation were figuring out how to condense things into 140 characters. That kind of classic low, are we just picking the low-hanging fruit with technology, or are we zombifying ourselves, feeding into this consumerist cycle? I mean, there's certainly in the present, in the short term, we are seeing more and more of that, more and more of the commodification of stuff that I would loosely characterize as brain junk. I think things like Instagram and Snapchat are just absolute vacuous time sinks. They're awful, awful products. But the reason I am optimistic is because instead of, narrow AI and algorithms that are not truly intelligent, the idea of creating artificial general intelligence gives me hope, because the power of intelligence to problem solve at a totally new scale, to mine data for new insights, to accelerate the pace of innovation and discovery, that is something we can see a trend for in human history. That it's had its trade-offs. But overall, the arc of progress has gone pretty well. We have liberated humanity from a tremendous amount of suffering. And so adding more intelligence into the mix, true general intelligence or even super intelligence, does give me hope for sustainability crises. But that said, I'm not the kind of optimist that's utopian. I'm not the kind of optimist that says, hand wave, we build more tech and it solves all of our problems. There are lots and lots of ways that the advent of artificial intelligence could go horribly wrong. As you say, maybe we just funnel it into more and more vacuous things that distract us from the great challenges of the age. Maybe it's harder than we think to create artificial general intelligence. And maybe the sustainability issues are less tractable than we would like. So it's not a case of it's all going to be fine, don't worry about it. It's a case of, good Lord, as you say, we're struggling. We're not really up to the task with the resources that we have. So by crikey, we need to bring something else into the mix and do our best to try and develop it safely so that we can have other tools in the arsenal.
Just one more sentence, because I mean, I think that the general problems have been solved like 50 years ago with the report of the Club of Rome. We know what we have to do, but people don't really do much. That's my concern.
That's also my concern. I think that's why one of the arguments in my book is that one of the biggest sustainability risks we face is actually the ongoing perpetuation of our ape brains. That this brand of cognition is just not purpose-built for the challenges of the age. So as confronting and as icky as it can feel, we actually do need to invent something smarter than ourselves, because we are not on top of this. We are not juggling all of these balls and keeping them in the air, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you to the questioner, and thank you to Elise. The next question. I read the first 2/3 of your book with joy and fascination. The last third left me feeling progressively more uncomfortable. Will we really be happy with the virtual sex you suggest maybe in our future? And human gestation without mothers, how will that work?
Love this question. And I love the honest feedback there. I think that the last third, as you say, is a third that makes it rattles the most cages. I absolutely understand why. It is a really confronting prospect to entertain the notion that maybe the way that intelligence persists is no longer through us giving birth to live progeny, to us rearing children, to us having families in the ways that we have done for millions of years. That is a hell of an idea to digest. And especially if I'm asking you to think about it, not in 1,000 years' time, but in your lifetime. Can we really be happy? I think that's a brilliant question. And I think the point of that second half of the book was really to bring that front and center and to say, what's really happening in my view is that we're living through transitional times that I think are going to be really, really hard for a lot of us to live through. I think the reality is a lot of us are not going to be particularly happy in the 21st century. I think there's evidence that in spite of our embarrassment of riches in the developed world, many of the richest children in history, for example, are deeply, deeply unhappy and are suffering from terrible mental health crises. This idea that we're torn between two worlds, that there is a kind of rug pull from the old life scripts, I don't celebrate that feeling or the experience of it. I think it's, in many ways painful. I'm merely trying to foreground some of the prospects that I think our politicians, our policymakers, and even as citizens, just thinking about our life arcs, we haven't got enough of a sense of alternative stories to be prepared for what might come. This is how these kinds of prospects can make us feel, right? This is confronting as hell. Can be deeply upsetting, can feel like something that we want to rail against, and maybe we should rail against it. My job is really to bring the possibilities to the fore. But as I said, questioner specifically asked about virtual sex and artificial wombs. I say in the book, I don't think artificial wombs are likely to take on in any mainstream way, because my expectation is that technology will get leapfrogged by strong AI. And there's not going to be this sort of long interim period where we're sort of having babies in this technologically advanced way. In many ways, because just hacking a biological machine is much slower and much harder than just creating intelligence in silicon, or that's the expectation. But I do say in the short term, I think if we could just snap our fingers and be able to gestate fetuses artificially, externally from a human body, there would be an army of modern women clamoring to use them, from same-sex couples to couples that are infertile, women who have had miscarriages that are in their late 30s or in their 40s. There's all sorts of reasons why people would want to avail themselves of this technology. And one of those reasons is that we are in a world now economically of two-income families, where it is, again, kind of paradoxically, more of a strain in such a wealthy world for women to be both mothers and to work. And there's a cultural kind of celebration of female empowerment and identity beyond the domestic sphere. And yet we're not very well set up to support women in this endeavor because of the financial constraints of, high housing costs, delayed ages of first marriage and parenthood. This is all really, really, really tough stuff. I'm certainly not saying like there's nothing beautiful or wonderful about pregnancy, breastfeeding, childbirth, or parenthood. I think there's so much about those experiences that have been and remain magical for human beings. I'm trying to push the envelope a bit to get us to try and imagine possible futures where we don't do those things in the same way anymore, and yet we are happy. And to virtual sex, just very briefly. Again, the prediction is not that everybody's going to be at home with the orgasmatron, like with their sex bots, and we're all just going to sink into that world. It's a more nuanced argument, really, about how technology is changing the landscape of the modern dating and mating markets, immersive VR porn, and just standard high bandwidth internet porn, shaping the expectations and the sexual proclivities of particularly younger generations. And so my argument is really about a sort of a growing subset of young men, particularly disenfranchised young men or socially awkward or low status men, gravitating more and more to some of these technologies. And as much as that can sort of make us feel sad or yuck or think, oh, isn't that awful? Isn't that a shame? I think it behooves us to look at the other side of the question and think, well, maybe it's good that in the interim, in these transition times, which are not what I expect to last for perpetuity, that maybe they're a decade or two of just an awkward interim transition, where at least there is a substitute for a human woman, where at least there is something that can give people a sense of wholeness, connection, and sexual fulfillment that is better than a Playboy centerfold.
Thank you. Okay. How can transhumanism view humanity as an interconnected species? Is there consideration that the change we advance can balance the sentience of all beings? Considering indigenous views, for example, in the indigenous people in Canada who consider 7 generations, or North America, 7 generations is the length of time to consider, and also don't place humans above, for example, cats or cockroaches. Can we expand this focus of transhumanism beyond just humans?
I think one of the ideas that interests me most about possible post-human futures is the idea of a hive mind coalescing, that you end up with quite kind of the opposite of a lot of the things that we're sort of railing against today, this atomization of the individual that, we heard a mention of the capitalist system earlier on. I love the idea that with more and more interfacing with advanced AI and, maybe the Neuralink type machine brain interface that Elon Musk is talking so much about these days, maybe there are versions of a future where we do integrate with post-human super intelligent AI. And the way I can imagine a lot of communication and connection taking place is, again, this is crude because I'm a human trying to imagine a post-human world, but something quasi-telepathic, something where almost like the software update for a fleet of Teslas or the software update for a bunch of iPhones, all of the minds are connected with universal stories and universal updates, and they can share thoughts and they can share knowledge basically instantaneously. I think one of the best kind of fictional renderings of this was in the film Her, the Spike Jonze film, where by the end of the film, the AI Samantha, does leave her human companion sort of very much in the dust as she goes from this human level AI to suddenly becoming superhuman, super intelligent. But her world, we get this glimpse of it with all of these other digital minds in the cloud, and the high speed connectivity, this like parallel processing that they're all undergoing, is something that I just don't think any traditional or modern concept has the words, has the language, has the framework to describe. It's going to be something new and different, but it might surprise us with how rich and fulfilling that form of connectivity could be.
Thank you. In your book, you explained that your grandmother is unable to understand or accept your ideas about the future. And the question is, has she come around since you wrote the book? Or in other words, are you finding other people are coming around and developing a more open perspective after they've had time for thought and reflection about transhumanism?
I love this question. My nonna, who I write about in the book, is actually very on board. She's the one I sort of describe as telling me for years and years, never grow old. It's the worst thing ever. She's all on board with anything that can make her healthier and happier and living a longer life. My grandfather, I think, my nonna, is quite a bit more skeptical. So I specifically talk about him he gets quite disgruntled when I talk about maybe health span extensions and better healthcare. Sort of tells me, yeah, they've been trying to cure cancer for decades and they promised they were going to do it 50 years ago and they haven't done it, and it's all bullshit. But yeah, he did read the book not long after it came out, and he, it's a biased sample, it's a family member, obviously they want to cheer you on, but he was very impressed by it and very moved by it. And we have had chats at their family home at the dining table about the possibilities for our species and about the idea that things are changing faster than they used to be. And yeah, he's basically nodded and said, it makes sense. To the broader question of reception, the feedback has been broadly very positive. But I do wonder, and I do sort of worry, that with a book like this, you are in many ways preaching to the converted. My aim was to write it for the broadest audience possible. I've tried to make it very accessible and tried not, there's as you'll know from my talk, there's a lot of confronting stuff there. But I've tried not to club the reader too hard over the head with stuff that just feels horrifying or untenable. And I've really tried to back up what I'm saying by narrativizing it in a way that can feel concrete and real. And I think that's largely worked. But I do suspect that this is one of those topics that will just forever remain deeply polarizing. And I think that's all the more reason why I want to talk about it, because usually when something engenders hostility and aversion and fear, that's a good sign that you've hit on a topic that's important. There's at least something in there that's worth talking about. I think Henry James has a great quote, and I'm going to butcher it. I don't remember the quote, but some version of, I don't want to be liked by everybody. If I had, there's absolutely no way I've done my job properly. And I do really live and think by that quote, that I'm not out to ruffle feathers or upset anybody. But I do think that these are some of the biggest and most important ideas of our time. And I really do want to be able to have deep conversations about where we're heading and how we can maybe, hopefully, try and nudge things in a better direction and in a sustainable direction for as many people as possible.
Thank you. So just a couple more questions to wrap up. So if I have not got to your question, I might have missed it in the chat. So if you had a question and you posted it, or if another question has popped into your head, please type it in right now, because we have a couple more minutes. One next question for you, Elise, where do you go next in your research, and what can we expect to hear from you in a few years?
Oh, that's a cracking question. I think I'm spending a fair bit of time sort of on the tail end of releasing this book, of thinking about what public communication means. And, you know, I have to say, really honest mini rant here. I am somewhat disillusioned with the idea of writing books, or somewhat, you know, I loved writing this book. And I think by nature, I'm the kind of ivory tower introvert that would just love to keep writing books. But I am somewhat disillusioned with the idea that books these days are not so much books in the traditional sense. They're so much more of a branding exercise, so much more often a lead magnet for a personal brand or a meme that we're trying to signal boost out into the world. And I think the danger of getting too embroiled in this kind of work, and particularly the public promotion of it, as important as these sorts of conversations are, is that you can get locked onto a treadmill where you're spending more time doing self-promotion than you are thinking. And what I really want to do, and what I'm dedicated to spending at least the next 12 months doing, is shutting up for a while and thinking really carefully about the nitty-gritty of some of the sub-questions that this big story implies. It's almost incompatible when you're sort of going around talking about this stuff all the time. It's food for thought, but unless you really sit in a room alone for a while and do deep reading and deep thinking and flow state kind of work, your ideas are going to remain shallow. And I want to deep dive more into some of the specifics of this, thinking about policy ramifications, thinking about, I guess I'm always on the hunt for the next big project, the thing that I'm going to dedicate years to at a time and deep diving into. And so that's going to be the next thing, thinking about what really matters and what might actually be able to have an impact if I spend 2-3 years deep diving. So watch this space and I'll report back.
Okay, thanks. One final question. Do the religiously inclined consider transhumanism to be blasphemous and against the word of God? Have you encountered any of that?
I have. So again, as a historian of transhumanism, what shocked me as a PhD candidate was finding evidence that there are quite rapidly growing groups of specifically religious-based transhumanist organizations. There is a Christian transhumanist organization. There is a Mormon transhumanist association, with more and more chapters sort of popping up all over the place. It seems to have a fascination for a lot of particularly Christian type thinkers, because there are seemingly these sort of narrative parallels and affinities with this idea of transcendence that, you know, we can think of in a religious vein, that, you know, in many stories is some version of a heaven or an afterlife. And I think in the 21st century, a lot of religious thinkers are quite excited by the idea of, oh, maybe that's what the Bible meant all along. Maybe we're meant to use technology and build heaven on earth. Maybe that's how it goes. So I've been very, very surprised to find the level of enthusiasm. And I've actually found that quite a few religious thinkers and organizations have been aware of the book and bought the book, which is nice to see. There are, you know, I suppose there's good reason for some of the overlap, that there were thinkers sort of in the 20th century that presaged a lot of transhumanist ideas. People like the French Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And he wrote a lot about these kind of metaphysical transcendence, but it was also very, like, he was a humanist thinker and an evolutionist, and he was sort of like unifying these two visions. But no doubt, there's no question that there will be elements of Christian conservatism that just find all of this repugnant. I can't say I've really encountered it or had anything to do with it, but I'm I would be very surprised if that wasn't the case. And I do know that certainly in America, there's a lot of increasing anti-transhumanist sentiment being whipped up in particular by the likes of Steve Bannon. That's like become a sort of pet scapegoat topic on a lot of his radio podcast discussions, that transhumanism is this kind of great conspiracy, a great reset, and sort of like, you know, whipping up a lot of anti-big tech ire and sentiment. And it's not to say that, you know, we shouldn't question or maybe even have real concerns about the big tech world. But yeah, I think that's an avenue where some of that hostility lurks. But yeah, so I'd say it really goes both ways with religion. Some surprisingly very pro, and some surely not so keen.
Thanks. Well, thanks again to Elise for a thought-provoking conversation, and thank you to the audience for your thoughtful questions. If you want to read more, you can find Elise's book for purchase online. And because of the limitations of Zoom, we can't properly applaud, but I invite everyone to show your appreciation by using the clap icon that you can find in the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. I don't know if this is an example of how we do things in the transhumanist world, but that's what we can do. CFIC relies entirely on donations and memberships to allow us to bring you events like this. Please visit our website at centerforinquiry.ca or email to info@centerforinquiry.ca for more information on how you can become a member or make a donation. We have some upcoming events. We have numerous other online events and presentations. Some are regularly weekly community events and other speaker talks. Coming up next Sunday evening, we have a talk on antinatalism. And in October, we have a talk on long-termism. All sorts of future things that can dovetail and relate to transhumanism. To get all the announcements and information about what's coming up, we invite everybody to join us on Meetup at our virtual branch. And again, thank you to everyone who attended, and we hope to see you again at another event soon.